U.S. Secretary of Defence Lloyd Austin announced $100 million in new military aid to Ukraine during an unannounced visit to Kyiv on Monday, pledging long-term American support amid growing concerns about the sustainability of a vital U.S. assistance. Now, how inclined is U.S. to continue its support for Ukraine, keeping rhetoric aside? To discuss matters further, we're being joined by Mr. Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Welcome to WION, sir.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Professor, keeping the Ukrainian rhetoric aside from the US side, as per you, is US in or is US out?
Well, the Biden administration, and indeed much of the international community, are still all in with defense of Ukraine against what is now a 21-month Russian invasion. We could talk about the sustained support, first of all, for Ukraine's defense, including air defense, which has helped enable the country survive the initial Russian onslaught, Vladimir Putin's food war, Vladimir Putin's energy war. We could talk about the assistance to try to help Ukraine liberate territory, such as the provision of armored vehicles, such as the impending provision of warplanes, including the U.S. F-16 fighter jets. And we can talk about the financial and economic assistance so that Ukraine's government can keep operating and providing public services. What complicates this is that in the U.S. there's a very small but very loud group of politicians, hard-right Republicans and Trumpists, who are trying to block any further U.S. aid to Ukraine. They are largely in the House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress. But because of the nature of the U.S. system, they were able, as a small group, to block the Biden administration's approach at the end of September for authorizing up to another $60 billion in military, financial, and economic assistance in forthcoming months. The Biden administration is trying again with the U.S. House, but we still have this small group of Republicans and Trumpists who are effectively holding U.S. aid hostage. But I would say that it needs to be very clear, this small group of politicians does not represent the majority of American legislators. It does not represent the Biden administration. I don't think it represents most of American public opinion. What will change the situation, and what will change it significantly, at least for the Americans, is if, as an outcome of the 2024 presidential election, a guy you might know named Donald Trump wins. Because if Trump wins, beyond being unpredictable, even arguably unstable in his opinions, this is the man who tried to blackmail Ukraine in 2019 by cutting off military aid unless they dish dirt on his Democratic rival, Joe Biden.
Now, Professor, there is the Presidential Drawdown Authority, the PDA, which is left with about $5.4 billion US dollars, which the president can dip into and aid Ukraine with. How long do you feel that will last? Because that is the last of it. At the other end, which is, if I'm not wrong, this is the Ukraine security assistance, which is already run out. The amount in that has been is already depleted. So we're pretty much left, the US is pretty much left with $5.4 billion. How long do you feel that will last? And after that, what next?
Well, the Pentagon has already said that 96% of American funds for military assistance have been used. So you really have a very small amount that is left without getting additional authorization. You then have, as you mentioned, an additional $5.4 billion, which is also to provide economic and financial assistance, again, to keep services running, to ensure that Ukraine's energy infrastructure continues to operate despite the Russian attacks, to break it, and to provide for future reconstruction. So yes, it is an imminent, I think, issue in the United States, probably from the spring of 2024. But I would add that even if we face this crisis with U.S. assistance, remember that there's assistance coming from other areas as well. And as significant as the U.S. assistance has been, the aid from Europe has been even larger to Ukraine, even though we don't talk about it as much. So U.S. aid is needed. The future authorization is needed, but it does not mean that all assistance for Ukraine collapses if these hard right Republicans continue to, hold Kyiv hostage.
So there is a chance that US may be able to or may not be able to continue with the assistance, but then European nations or the other Western nations are still providing. Which brings me to the next point, sir. There have been many reports of European nations that are backing off from sending aid to Ukraine as well. Of course, not all of them. There are few. But can this be seen in conjunction with the US increasing distance from Ukraine or inability to continue with the aid to Ukraine?
Well, we need to be careful about media reports because the media can get very excited, and I understand that. In fact, when you're talking about European countries that are blocking or suspending assistance to Ukraine, to my knowledge, there are two. There is Hungary, led by a man named Viktor Orban, who's been a longtime ally of Vladimir Putin, and there is Slovakia, whose new government under Robert Fico is also suspending further military aid, at least government military aid, if not private aid to Ukraine. Those are the only two countries we're talking about that are really blocking aid to Ukraine individually. The problem, the challenge is if Hungary, in particular, which is a member of the European Union, tries to block European Union assistance to Ukraine and tries to block further sanctions against Russia. So Hungary, in other words, can be a spoiler in those cases where you need a unanimous EU decision to continue aid to Ukraine. But I wouldn't, let's not confuse Hungary and Slovakia with representing most of Europe. In the past few days, we've had further commitments of military, economic, and financial aid from countries such as Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, and beyond Europe. Japan has just pledged another $175 million in reconstruction assistance.
Now, I just wanted to get your opinion on this one as well, Professor. There were reports that Europe will be unable to supply some 1 million rounds of artillery shells. So even if they do not want to back off from providing aid to Ukraine, do you feel there is an inability, like US is finding, there is an inability of funds or could be an internal conflict of interest as far as the US is concerned? Europe is also facing some kind of inability to continue providing the kind of aid that Ukraine needs, given the basis of this report which I just mentioned?
Well, the Europeans are providing some artillery shells to Ukraine. The issue is that they will not meet the 1 million artillery shells target by March. As of October, they had provided about 300,000. And that is an important structural issue. You're talking about not just ramping up, but reconfiguring an entire arms industry because of the imminent crisis of the Russian invasion. And that takes time. You don't just simply flick a switch overnight to get that increase in hundreds of thousands of shells. So I do think that while the target has been missed in March, again, the issue is Europe on a longer-term course to provide these types of munitions and other assistance? I'll put it in my words. This is not a sprint. The media quite often likes to say, let's finish this. Let's have a result. You don't get a sprint in defeating Russia. It is more of a marathon. And the question is, will the U.S., Europe, other countries across the international community, including India, what place do they have in that marathon as we continue to face the reality that Vladimir Putin tried and so far has failed to conquer his neighbor?
And that pretty much brings me to the next one that I want to ask you, sir. What's next as per you? Where do you see this heading? It's not a sprint. It is going to be a kind of a marathon. But how long do you think it's going to last? What's next in the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, I think there are individual developments on the battlefield. It is not a complete stalemate as is represented in the media. The Russians have tried for now almost 2 months to take a city in the east of Ukraine, Avdiivka, just to show that they can still take a city. They are suffering heavy casualties trying to do so. In the south, the most significant story has been that Ukraine has advanced in recent weeks and is now on the east side of the Dnipro River. This is in the Kherson region. If they continue this advance, and it is an if, then it does mean that they are starting to move towards the coastline and could begin with that objective of cutting off Russian-occupied Crimea. I don't think you'll have a significant victory, as it were, over the winter. But I do think by early 2024, we're going to look at that gradual Ukrainian advance and assess, okay, is this enough where the battle will continue, or do we move to negotiations, even with Russia still in control of some of Ukraine? The problem with negotiations, cut up through the propaganda, the spin, the one person who is against negotiations is a guy named Vladimir Putin. Because if he ever negotiates, he has to admit that his dream of seizing at least 4 regions in Ukraine, plus Crimea, that dream has ended.
All right, Professor Lucas, thank you so much for joining in with all your insights on this. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, and we'd like to have you back on WION to discuss matters further. Of course, this and a lot more that's happening all over the world.
Always a pleasure. My best to you, my best to your viewers.
Thank you.
Thank you.